The moment the air conditioner went silent, I knew this wasn't a power outage. It was a message. The steady hum that had filled my living room every summer evening disappeared so suddenly that the silence almost rang in my ears. Outside my front window, every porch light on the street still glowed warm against the fading Texas sky. My neighbor's television flickered through his curtains. The house across from mine was running sprinklers that hissed softly across perfectly trimmed grass. Only my home sat in complete darkness. I stepped onto the porch with a flashlight in one hand, and the heavy July heat wrapped around me like a damp blanket. The smell of fresh-cut grass mixed with hot asphalt rising from the street after a day of triple-digit temperatures. Then I saw it. My electric meter had been locked with a bright red disconnect tag hanging from the side. Across the front, in bold black letters, it read service terminated due to HOA compliance violation. I actually laughed because no utility company in Texas should have been using HOA paperwork as a reason to disconnect residential service. Not legally. Not ever. Someone wanted me scared enough not to ask questions. Someone assumed I didn't understand how the system worked. They picked the wrong house. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 42 years old, and I've spent the last 20 years designing electrical infrastructure for hospitals, emergency facilities, and industrial plants where losing power isn't just inconvenient, it can cost millions of dollars every hour. Electricity follows rules. Regulations follow laws. Paperwork leaves fingerprints. That's something people drunk on fake authority never seem to understand. I walked back inside, where the temperature was already climbing. The refrigerator had fallen silent. My digital clocks were blank. Even the old ceiling fan my father installed before he passed away had frozen in place, its wooden blades casting long shadows across the hallway. That fan had survived thunderstorms, ice storms, and more than one lightning strike over the years. It wasn't going to be a homeowners association that finally defeated it. My phone buzzed. An email from the HOA appeared with the subject line, Final Enforcement Action. According to the letter, my electricity had been disconnected because I had committed an unresolved architectural violation that threatened community standards. There was only one problem. The violation they referenced had never existed. No inspection. No warning. No hearing. No appeal. Just a fabricated file number attached to my address and enough confidence to believe nobody would challenge it. I could almost smell Brenda Whitmore's expensive perfume lingering in the HOA office as she signed whatever papers she thought would make this disappear quietly. She'd spent years convincing people that arguing with the board was a waste of time. Most homeowners paid the fines. Most apologized even when they'd done nothing wrong. Most accepted whatever story landed in their mailbox because fighting City Hall felt impossible. But my father taught me something while wiring this very house decades ago. He'd tighten every terminal twice before flipping a breaker and always say the same thing. Bad connections eventually reveal themselves. You just have to be patient enough to find them. Standing there in the darkness of the home he built with his own hands, I realized this wasn't about electricity anymore. Someone had forged a path through a system they didn't fully understand, and somewhere behind that fake violation was one mistake they never imagined anyone would notice. The house where I stood sweating in the dark was never supposed to become the center of a fight. It was simply home. My parents bought the place in 1988 when this neighborhood was still surrounded by open fields instead of shopping centers and carefully landscaped entrances with decorative stone signs. My father, Daniel Walker, was a master electrician who believed every wire hidden behind a wall reflected the character of the person who installed it. If nobody would ever see the work, he insisted it should be done even better. He spent nearly every weekend improving something around the property with his worn leather tool belt hanging from his shoulder and a pencil tucked behind his ear. Even now I can still remember the smell of sawdust mixing with fresh coffee drifting through the garage every Saturday morning while classic country music played softly from an old radio balanced on a shelf. My mother, Linda, filled the house with warmth in quieter ways. She planted the oak tree that now shaded the front porch and insisted every neighbor deserved a homemade pie at least once. She knew every birthday on the block and somehow managed to turn strangers into friends without ever trying too hard. When they both passed away within 3 years of each other, selling the house never crossed my mind. Every hallway carried memories. Every light switch reminded me of lessons my father had patiently taught me. Every room felt like another chapter of my family's story. I studied electrical engineering, earned my professional licenses, and eventually specialized in designing reliable power systems for hospitals and emergency operations centers across Texas. My work demanded precision because mistakes in my profession could affect thousands of people. That discipline followed me home. Every permit for every improvement on my property sat neatly organized inside a filing cabinet. Every inspection report had been scanned and backed up. Every receipt, photograph, and maintenance record had its place. Friends teased me that I documented my house like it was a government facility. Maybe they were right. Organization had become second nature after years of solving problems that depended on tiny details everyone else overlooked. Moving into this neighborhood full-time after my parents passed seemed like the right decision. I wanted quiet evenings on the back patio listening to cicadas, weekend projects in my workshop, and the simple comfort of living where I had grown up. At first, everything seemed exactly as I remembered. Children rode bicycles down the sidewalks. Families waved during evening walks. The smell of charcoal grills floated through the air every holiday weekend. It felt like the kind of place where people still looked out for one another. Then the homeowners association slowly changed. New board members arrived. Friendly conversations became official notices. Community meetings turned into lectures about compliance instead of discussions about neighbors. Rules seemed less about protecting property values and more about reminding everyone who held authority. I stayed polite. I paid every assessment on time. I attended meetings when my schedule allowed. I never imagined that simply following the rules would eventually make me the biggest obstacle to people who had quietly stopped following them themselves. Brenda Whitmore did not look like someone who could make an entire neighborhood nervous. She stood barely 5'6", dressed almost exclusively in pastel blazers that matched the season, with perfectly styled blonde hair that never seemed to move no matter how strong the Texas wind blew. She drove a white luxury sport utility vehicle that somehow always looked freshly detailed, and she carried the same leather clipboard everywhere as if it were an extension of her arm. If you met her for the first time at a neighborhood barbecue, you would probably think she volunteered because she loved the community. That illusion usually lasted about 5 minutes. Brenda had been elected HOA President 4 years earlier after promising transparency, beautification, and responsible budgeting. Somewhere along the way those promises transformed into inspections, citations, and endless reminders that she alone understood what was best for everyone else. She had a habit of smiling while delivering bad news, the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. Her perfume always arrived a second before she did, sweet enough to almost hide the sharp scent of fresh printer ink from the violation letters tucked beneath her clipboard. She liked to begin every conversation with the words, "I am only enforcing the rules," even when nobody could find the rule she claimed existed. Over time the neighborhood quietly adapted around her. Trash cans disappeared from curbs exactly on schedule. Holiday decorations came down early to avoid arguments. People repainted shutters simply because Brenda hinted the color looked tired. Neighbors who once gathered on front porches now spoke in lower voices, glancing toward the street whenever her white vehicle rolled past at walking speed. Nobody wanted to become the next example at an HOA meeting. The board members rarely questioned her decisions. Most simply nodded, approved whatever paperwork she placed in front of them, and returned to their own lives. Rumors spread that she had developed unusually close relationships with the community management company responsible for processing violations and collecting fines. Nothing anyone could prove, just enough whispers to make people uncomfortable. I never joined those conversations because I believed facts mattered more than speculation. If someone crossed a legal line, evidence would eventually expose it. Brenda seemed almost disappointed that I never reacted emotionally to her inspections. When she sent a reminder about repainting my mailbox after a minor scratch, I fixed it the next afternoon. When she questioned a replacement porch light fixture, I emailed the city permit and manufacturer specifications before sunset. Every time she expected resistance, she received documentation instead. Looking back, I think that frustrated her more than any argument ever could have. She could intimidate people who relied on opinions, but paperwork was another matter entirely. The first sign that something had shifted came one quiet Thursday morning when I found a bright yellow notice taped perfectly square across my front door. It claimed an architectural modification on my property had been completed without approval. I stood there listening to mockingbirds in the oak tree above my porch while reading the letter 3 times. The violation referenced an improvement that did not exist, cited a date when I had been working 200 miles away, and included a file number I had never seen before. For the first time since Brenda became president, I had the unmistakable feeling that this was no longer about enforcing neighborhood standards. Someone had decided to create a problem first and worry about the facts later. I did exactly what any reasonable homeowner should have done. I gathered every permit, every inspection report, every photograph, and every receipt connected to my property, then drove to the HOA office the following morning expecting a simple misunderstanding that could be cleared up in 10 minutes. The office smelled like fresh coffee and new carpet, the kind of carefully managed environment designed to make everything feel official. Brenda barely glanced at the folder I placed on her desk. She leaned back in her chair, folded her hands together, and smiled with the quiet confidence of someone who had already decided how the conversation would end. "Our records indicate the violation is valid," she said without opening a single page. I politely pointed to the permit dates, the city inspection stamps, and the photographs showing nothing had changed on my property during the period listed in her notice. She pushed the folder back toward me as though the documents themselves were inconveniencing her. "If you disagree with the board's findings, you may submit an appeal after paying the administrative review fee." The fee was $500. Paying it would not guarantee a hearing. It would only place my name on the agenda at some future meeting if the board decided my request deserved consideration. I walked out with the folder tucked under my arm, feeling the hot afternoon sun reflect off the pavement while cicadas buzzed in the oak trees overhead. The neighborhood looked as peaceful as ever, yet something beneath the surface had clearly changed. 3 days later another letter arrived by certified mail. The alleged violation had now been classified as unresolved noncompliance. Daily penalties had begun accumulating. The amount itself did not concern me nearly as much as the language. Every paragraph sounded strangely rehearsed, repeating legal phrases that felt copied from somewhere else rather than written for my situation. I responded exactly as I always had. I documented everything, attached supporting evidence, and requested the specific inspection records that justified their claim. My email was acknowledged within minutes by an automated response. No human being ever answered the questions. Instead, another notice appeared 48 hours later warning that continued failure to resolve the issue could result in additional enforcement measures permitted under association policy. Around the same time, subtle changes began appearing throughout the neighborhood. My electronic gate access to the community recreation center stopped working. My homeowner portal suddenly displayed overdue compliance actions that had never existed before. A package delivery driver mentioned someone from the HOA had advised him not to leave deliveries on my porch because my property was under active enforcement review. Even neighbors who had always waved during evening walks now seemed uncertain, offering polite smiles before quickly looking away. Rumors travel faster than facts in quiet neighborhoods. Then came the email that made my stomach tighten. It stated the association had contacted the electric utility regarding what it described as an unresolved safety concern connected to my property improvements. That sentence alone made no sense. Homeowners associations did not have authority to declare electrical hazards or request utility action without proper regulatory involvement. I immediately called the customer service department at the power company. The representative sounded courteous but unusually cautious. She confirmed they had received documentation concerning my address, but she could not discuss the file while it remained under internal review. As the call ended, I stared at my reflection in the dark computer monitor, listening to the steady hum of my air conditioner filling the room. For the first time, I realized this was no longer a disagreement over paperwork. Someone was actively trying to turn fabricated documents into real consequences, and they were counting on nobody looking closely enough to stop them. The disconnect happened the following evening just as the weather forecast warned another record-breaking heat wave was settling over central Texas. 1 second the kitchen lights glowed across the polished hardwood floors, and the next the entire house fell silent except for the ticking of the old wall clock my mother had insisted would outlast every modern appliance we ever bought. I stepped outside expecting to see a transformer failure somewhere down the street, but the neighborhood looked completely normal. Porch lights stretched in both directions like nothing had happened. Television screens flickered through living room windows. The faint smell of someone grilling hamburgers drifted across the cul-de-sac while children laughed somewhere near the community park. Only my house had gone dark. I walked straight to the electric meter with my flashlight and found the bright red disconnect tag hanging exactly where I had feared it would be. My phone immediately filled with notifications. The refrigerator temperature alarm. The home security battery warning. The network server in my workshop switching to emergency backup. Every system was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. So was I. Instead of reacting with anger, I started documenting everything. I photographed the meter from every angle. I recorded the time down to the second using the atomic clock application on my phone. I captured video showing every neighboring house still receiving service. Then I carefully examined the disconnect paperwork attached beneath the lock. Something about it felt wrong. Years of reviewing engineering drawings had trained my eyes to notice patterns most people ignored. The document carried an authorization number that seemed oddly short. The formatting of the reference code did not match any utility work orders I had seen during infrastructure projects. Even stranger, the supposed inspection date listed on the form fell on a Sunday. Utility field inspections for routine residential compliance were not normally scheduled on Sundays in our service area. That tiny detail settled into the back of my mind like a pebble inside a shoe. Small enough to overlook. Impossible to ignore forever. I called the emergency customer service line again. After verifying my identity, the representative politely explained that she could only confirm the disconnect had been processed using documentation submitted through an external compliance request. When I asked which agency had filed it, she hesitated for several seconds before saying she was not authorized to disclose additional information. Her careful wording told me almost as much as the answer itself. Someone had found a way to make unofficial paperwork appear official long enough to trigger real action. I ended the call, sat on my front porch with a bottle of warm water, and watched the sun disappear behind the oak trees my mother had planted decades earlier. Crickets gradually replaced the sound of lawn mowers as evening settled over the neighborhood. Brenda probably believed the darkness surrounding my house marked the end of the argument. Instead, it became the beginning of an investigation. Somewhere inside the stack of notices, emails, and fabricated records was a mistake that could not survive close examination. The lights might have gone out, but the people responsible had unknowingly illuminated the first crack in their own carefully constructed story. Edit by sunrise the next morning my kitchen already felt like an oven. The refrigerator had lost its battle against the heat hours earlier, and the familiar smell of fresh coffee had been replaced by warm air carrying the faint scent of melting ice from a cooler I had dragged into the dining room. I loaded my laptop, external hard drive, and every document related to the property into my pickup truck and drove to the regional utility office instead of making another phone call. Some questions deserve answers from people, not automated systems. The customer service representative listened carefully as I explained the situation, then disappeared into a back office for nearly 20 minutes. When she returned, her expression had changed. She could not release the complete file without a formal records request, but she quietly confirmed one detail that immediately caught my attention. The authorization packet submitted for my address had not originated from a city inspector, county official, or state agency. It had arrived through a third party claiming supporting compliance authority. That was unusual enough to raise internal questions even inside the utility company. She suggested I submit a public records request immediately because every document associated with the disconnect would eventually become part of the official file. As I thanked her and walked back toward the parking lot, the pieces in my head began shifting into a different picture. This was never about electricity. The power disconnect was simply the final domino in a much larger chain of paperwork. Back at home I set up my laptop using a portable battery station in the garage and started comparing every notice Brenda had ever sent me over the previous 4 years. Most people would have looked only at the accusations. I looked at formatting, timestamps, digital signatures, reference numbers, revision codes, and metadata. Engineers spend careers hunting tiny inconsistencies because systems rarely fail in obvious ways. They fail where someone assumes nobody will notice. After several hours my eyes stopped on something almost invisible. The file number from my alleged architectural violation shared the exact same formatting pattern as a landscaping citation Brenda had issued to another homeowner nearly 2 years earlier. Even the spacing between characters matched perfectly. Curious, I called my neighbor, Harold Jensen, a retired surveyor who had lived across the street since before my parents bought this house. Harold shuffled across with a thick accordion folder tucked beneath his arm. He had kept every HOA letter he had ever received. The next 48 hours became an exercise in patience instead of confrontation. I knew better than to storm into the HOA office waving accusations because people who manipulate paperwork usually make their biggest mistakes when they believe nobody is watching. I filed formal public records requests with the electric utility, requested every document connected to my address, and sent certified letters requiring copies of every inspection report, photograph, internal note, and board authorization related to my alleged violation. Then I waited. While the requests moved through the system, Harold quietly introduced me to 2 other homeowners who had experienced strangely similar situations. One had received repeated citations for a fence that had already passed inspection months earlier. Another had been fined for landscaping changes that city permit records clearly showed were never made. We met around my dining room table with battery-powered lanterns casting soft pools of light across stacks of folders because my electricity still had not been restored. The room smelled faintly of warm paper, black coffee poured from a thermos, and the cedar shelves my father had built years ago. Nobody raised their voice. We simply compared dates, signatures, document numbers, and photographs. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Different violations. Different addresses. Different years. Yet the same formatting, the same approval language, and in several cases, identical wording copied line for line. It looked less like independent inspections and more like someone repeatedly filling in blanks on a template. 3 days later the first response from the utility company arrived. I opened the envelope slowly, feeling the thick official paper between my fingers. Inside was the processing log connected to my service disconnect. The authorization packet had indeed come from an outside source claiming unresolved compliance documentation. Even more interesting, the packet included no city inspection report, no electrical safety finding, and no signed determination from any licensed authority. It relied entirely on attached documents supplied by the requesting party. I immediately compared those attachments against the notices Brenda had sent me over the previous month. My pulse quickened. The document identification number printed on one attachment differed from another by only a single digit, yet both supposedly represented inspections completed nearly 6 months apart. Even the digital timestamps revealed something unusual. Multiple files claimed to have been created on different days, but the embedded metadata showed they had all been generated within the same afternoon. Engineers trust timestamps because computers rarely care about personal opinions. They simply record what happened. I enlarged every scanned signature until individual pixels became visible on my monitor. The signatures that appeared to belong to different inspectors contained identical pressure patterns and matching imperfections. They were not handwritten separately. They had been copied. Harold leaned closer to the screen, adjusted his glasses again, and quietly said the words neither of us had wanted to say out loud. Somebody had built an official-looking system by recycling the same digital documents over and over again. At that moment the darkness inside my house no longer felt like a punishment. It felt like evidence. Every hour my power remained disconnected increased the consequences of decisions that had apparently been made using paperwork that could not survive careful examination. Brenda believed she controlled the narrative because she controlled the letters people received. She had forgotten that every document tells two stories. One is the story written on the page. The other is the story hidden inside the details. The monthly board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening, and for the first time in years the community clubhouse parking lot filled long before sunset. Pickup trucks, family sedans, and golf carts lined both sides of the entrance while neighbors gathered in small circles speaking in voices just quiet enough to avoid attracting attention. I carried 2 binders, my laptop, and a portable battery pack into the meeting room. The familiar smell of brewed coffee and polished wood drifted through the air while fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. Brenda stood at the front of the room arranging neatly stacked agendas as though this would be another routine meeting about landscaping and mailbox paint colors. When she saw me walk in carrying far more paperwork than usual, her smile tightened for only a fraction of a second before returning to its practiced calm. The meeting began exactly on schedule. Financial updates. Pool maintenance. Community events. Then came homeowner comments. Brenda glanced at the clock and announced each resident would have 3 minutes. I stood, thanked the board for recognizing me, and placed the first binder on the table without raising my voice. Instead of arguing, I projected a simple timeline onto the screen behind the board members. Every notice. Every email. Every inspection date. Every disconnect record. The room became noticeably quieter. I showed how multiple violations supposedly created months apart contained identical formatting, identical language, and matching document structures. Then I displayed enlarged metadata captured directly from the electronic files released through the public records request. Creation time separated by only minutes. Revision histories that contradicted the printed dates. Repeated document identification patterns appearing across unrelated properties. Nobody interrupted. Even Brenda stopped taking notes. Harold quietly stood beside me and distributed copies comparing notices from 3 different homeowners. As neighbors flipped through the pages, I could hear nothing except paper sliding across tables and the distant hum of the clubhouse air conditioning. One board member leaned closer to examine the side-by-side documents, then slowly looked toward Brenda without saying a word. I opened the second binder and presented the utility company's processing records. They confirmed the disconnect request had relied entirely upon externally supplied compliance documents rather than findings from any electrical inspection authority. I carefully explained that I was not accusing the utility company of wrongdoing. They had processed paperwork presented as legitimate. The real question was how those documents had been created in the first place. Brenda finally stood and insisted the board had acted in good faith based on information available at the time. It sounded confident until I displayed one final comparison. The digital signature used on multiple inspection forms matched perfectly down to microscopic image imperfections despite supposedly belonging to different inspectors on different dates. The silence that followed felt heavier than any speech could have been. One by one, neighbors who had remained quiet for years began describing similar experiences. Different violations. Different properties. The same confusing paperwork. The same unanswered questions. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, I realized the room had stopped seeing me as a homeowner defending himself. They were beginning to see a pattern that reached far beyond my house, and once people recognize a pattern, it becomes almost impossible to pretend it never existed. The meeting ended without applause, without shouting, and without the dramatic scenes people imagine when the truth finally comes to light. Instead, it ended with something far more powerful. Questions. The board's attorney requested copies of every document I had presented before anyone left the room. Two board members quietly announced they wanted an independent review of every compliance action issued during the past 5 years. Brenda gathered her folders more slowly than usual, avoiding eye contact with the residents who had once accepted every word she said without hesitation. The confidence that had followed her into every meeting was gone, replaced by the uneasy silence of someone realizing the paperwork she depended upon had become the evidence everyone else wanted to examine. 3 days later my electricity was restored. The utility technician arrived just after 8 o'clock on a clear Thursday morning. He unlocked the meter, completed his inspection, and apologized for the inconvenience without commenting further. I understood why. He was there to restore service, not explain decisions made long before he became involved. The moment the main breaker clicked back into place, familiar sounds slowly returned to the house. The refrigerator compressor came alive with its steady hum. The air conditioner pushed cool air through vents that had been silent for nearly a week. The ceiling fan my father had installed years ago began turning once again, its wooden blades slicing quietly through the afternoon heat exactly as they always had. I stood there for several seconds listening to ordinary sounds that suddenly felt extraordinary. Over the following month, the independent review uncovered far more than anyone expected. Numerous compliance files required additional verification because supporting documentation could not be properly traced. Several enforcement actions were withdrawn while outside specialists examined digital records and administrative procedures. The Homeowners Association Management Company announced changes to its internal review process, and the board voted to require independent verification before any future action involving essential utility services could even be considered. Brenda resigned before the review reached its final stage. Her resignation letter described the decision as personal, but nobody in the neighborhood believed timing was merely a coincidence. Harold smiled the first time we passed each other during an evening walk and said the street finally felt like the place we remembered years ago. Neighbors started talking on front porches again. Children rode bicycles until sunset. People stopped looking over their shoulders whenever an official envelope appeared in the mailbox because they knew someone would actually question it if something looked wrong. One evening I carried a fresh cup of coffee onto my front porch just as the sun slipped behind the oak tree my mother had planted decades earlier. Warm light filtered through the branches while the porch lamp switched on automatically above my head. I looked at that simple light for a long moment because it represented something much larger than electricity. My father always believed good wiring was invisible when everything was working properly. You only noticed it after someone ignored the rules that kept the whole system safe. Communities are not much different. They function because ordinary people choose honesty over convenience and accountability over unchecked authority. The people responsible never expected anyone to examine the details closely enough to expose the cracks beneath the surface. They thought darkness would make me give up. Instead, it gave everyone the chance to finally see the truth in plain sight.